Well, welcome. We're happy to have another opportunity to study with you in this Bible overview. We looked at the patriarchal age. Now we're going through a number of lessons dealing with the history and unfolding of the Mosaic age. And we're in the book of 2 Samuel. And in this lesson, I'd like to cover 2 Samuel chapter 1 through 5, dealing with David being exalted first to be king of Judah, and then becomes the king of all Israel at the age of 37. And many lessons to be learned about David and how he trusted in the providence of God, that he kept God's purpose first in his mind, and eventually was exalted by God's overruling will to become the king over God's people, as he had been anointed by the prophet Samuel to be. This is by the time he becomes the king of all of Israel, it takes 20 years for that to come to pass. But it's a remarkable story filled with all kinds of twists and turns, and just endless lessons from history to give us encouragement in doing what is right and discouragement in doing those things that are wrong. And it certainly should build up our trust in the promises of God and in his overruling will that is going to accomplish his eternal purpose in the end. It is worked out in the coming of Christ and establishment of the church, and it's going to work out till the end of time. And God is going to be overall in the end. And we should live our lives with that kind of an understanding. David, that's one of his basic characteristics of his faith, is that he trusted the purpose of God working in his life. And although he made a lot of mistakes, he would repent truly and turn back to God and try to do his best when he understood what God's will was. In looking at David's life, we left off last time with David among the Philistines. He was in the hire of and working for the king of the Philistines of the city of Gath, Achash, and David had, been able to rescue his family and bring them back. They'd been taken captive by some Amalekites, and he came back to the city of Ziklag. You remember it had been burned to the ground, and there were men that came over to him from the land of Israel to join themselves with him after the death of Saul. And a couple of days after he got back to Ziklag, on the third day, an Amalekite came from the battlefield where Saul and his sons had been killed on Mount Gilboa, and he came to report the death of Saul to David. He hadn't taken a bath or cleaned himself. He looked like one that was in mourning, and he brought the news of the battle and how it had gone against the people of God, and that Saul and his sons were dead. And David doubted the report that he gave and wanted to know about what proof he had that Saul had really been killed. And he pulled out Saul's bracelet and Saul's crown that he had taken from his head. He claimed that he had came upon Saul when he was wounded and the Philistines were approaching, and that Saul had begged him to end his life lest he fell into the hands of the Philistines. Well, we know his story is a lie, because the Holy Spirit has revealed in the book of 1 Samuel how it was that Saul had fallen on his own sword and killed himself, and then his armor bearer followed suit and did the same. So this man is trying to make himself seem more important than he is, and he brings this news to David, and David and his men mourned for Saul. The man that brought the message and told this false story about killing the king, he thought that he was going to receive some reward from David, but instead David mourned for Saul and for Jonathan all the way until evening, he and his men mourned for the nation. And then David interrogated the man further and found out that the man was an Amalekite. And he ordered that man to be killed because he had raised his hand against God's anointed. David, in all those years fleeing from Saul, had respected the anointed king of Israel, and he left it to God to remove Saul. He wasn't going to lift his hand against the established government. And this man shouldn't have done so either. So David said to him, "Your blood is on your head, for your mouth has testified against you, saying, I have killed the Lord's anointed." So with your own mouth, you said that you killed Saul. So we can see here that this excuse that he used, that Saul asked him to do it, that he was putting Saul out of his misery, was not acceptable to David, and it's not acceptable to God to take innocent life and to shed blood. And if we do such a thing, the guilt of that blood of the innocent is upon our own head, and we'll be held accountable. And this man was put to death because he claimed that he had killed Saul and that he had put him to death. So again, you see an example of David always waited on God's providence. He didn't try to get ahead of the will of God. He didn't try to do evil in order to bring about what he thought was a good thing, him ruling over the land. But he let God work out through his providence, bringing him to the throne. He lived for God's purpose, and that's what all of us ought to do, is we are going to do good and to do our duty and to do the things that are right. And we're going to leave the will of God to his providence when it comes to removing governments and things of that nature. So he was free from selfishness, any kind of malicious desire on his own behalf. He was about God's will. He believed in God's control. He doesn't slumber or sleep, is what David said in Psalms 121 and verse 4. He knew that God ruled the world and that his providence was active among the kingdoms of men. And he acted only in harmony with God's law as he saw it and understood it. He tried to maintain a good conscience. So what did the things that we've seen David doing in preparing for his reign? Well, during that time of exile and the time that he was even in foreign land, he fought the enemies of the kingdom of God. He protected loyal followers that came to him, that he was ready to move into Judah when the time came. So he kept himself ready for when the opportunity came for him to return to Judah and to become the king of Israel according to God's will. We're told that he wrote a song to praise Jonathan and Saul after their death, so a funeral song, and talked about the beauty of the king, the beauty of all the young men of Israel that had died in battle. It's called the Song of the Bow, and it's in the last half of chapter 1. Your beauty, O Israel, is slain on your high places. How have the mighty fallen? So that's been quoted many times and read at many funerals where great people have died. You can see that David praised the good that was in Saul and praised the heroic acts that he did as the leader of the country in his death. He didn't speak evil of the dead, but he tried to praise those things that had been done that were right, and the brave things that Jonathan had done. He said, may they not tell it in Gath. May the enemies not rejoice with their idols because they've won this victory over the army of Israel. May Mount Gilboa be a symbol of defeat and calamity because of the death of Saul and the army and his sons there. He praised Saul and Jonathan in the song and talks about how they had brought so many blessings and how brave they were in battle. Well, they were victorious in many battles. They were pleasant. They were united at times in the past, swift and strong. Women were clothed in luxurious garments in scarlet and ornaments of gold because of the successes that Saul and Jonathan had in their battles against the enemies of God. So there had been much material gain that had come to the people. Jonathan, he says, he loved more than the love of women, his close friendship and bond of faith that he had with Jonathan, and he had an unselfish love and loyalty for that man. And then David is made king in Hebron in chapter 2 of 2 Samuel. David inquires of God whether he should go up to Hebron. It was a major city in the tribe of Judah, which is in the southern part of the land of Palestine. And it's mentioned as a city that had been taken by Caleb. Remember, one of the two good spies that served the Lord fully, that had a different kind of spirit. And even though that land of Hebron and the hill there were controlled by the Anakim, the giants, at the age of 85, Caleb had taken that territory, and it had made it a city. And it had, of course, become a main headquarters in the land of Judah. And it's a very safe place as far as its relationship to Saul and Benjamin. You know, Saul was from the tribe of Benjamin. You can see on the map that when you're in Hebron, you've got a good buffer zone there, a good distance to keep you safe. It was also a fortified city. When David moved there, Ahinoam, his wife, and Abigail were with him when he moved into the city of Hebron. There, the elders of Judah and the people came to him and anointed him as king over the house of Judah. He had been anointed in the past by Samuel, and he had protected them even during those days that he was having to hide from Saul, and had sent them gifts from the booty that he received from his battles. And the people remembered all of those good things that David had done. He was told about what happened with Saul and his sons' bodies that were hung on the wall, and how the men of Jabesh Gilead had risked their lives to go and take their bodies down and bury them. And he sent a letter to praise them for the love that they had shown and the courage they had shown. And it was a very honest praise that could be given to those people for showing their loyalty to one who had delivered them and done so much good for them in the past. And also it was very a diplomatic thing that showed the good attitude that David had towards Saul, and that he still had regard for his sons and so on. And that would certainly put him in good stead with the people of the northern tribes. Well, we're told at this time that Abner makes Ishbosheth the king over Israel. So part of Saul's family was his general, Abner, and Abner was a powerful man among the Benjamites, and he installs one of the surviving sons of Saul, Ishbosheth, to reign over the northern tribes of Israel. So at this time you have a divided kingdom. David ruling in the tribe of Judah and Ishbosheth ruling in the northern tribe. We're told that Ishbosheth was 40 years old and that he reigned for 2 years, is what the text says. Some of the numbers that we have in the book of 2 Samuel and 1 Samuel are sometimes have been corrupted in the manuscripts over the years to where you're not quite sure if the numbers are recorded accurately. Ishbosheth means son of shame. It was a name that the people gave to him because his real name was Ishbaal, and since Baal is a false god and a shame to worship, they called him Ishbosheth here in the book of 2 Samuel. David was king of Judah in Hebron for 7 years, we're told. So he took up his reign there at the age of 30 and reigned over Judah. And he's happy at this time to trust the providence of God to bring the northern tribes over to him to make him king. And all he is going to do is fight defensive actions to protect himself and the people of Judah. But he is not going to use his forces to go to war with the northern tribes and make himself king by his own power, but he's going to leave it to God's providence to bring him to that rule. So you can see on the map there that Mahanaim is on the other side of the Jordan, and a little bit to the north is where Ishbosheth has his capital at that time, and David's ruling down in the southern part of Judah central part of Judah there in Hebron. Then there is a contest we're told about in chapter 2 in verses 12 through 23, a time of conflict between these two kingdoms of God's people. You have Joab, the general, the nephew and general of David's army in Judah, and have Abner, the general of the army that is still loyal to the house of Saul, to Ishbosheth, who is fighting. And the two generals and some of their soldiers, their army, met at Gibeah in Benjamin. And Abner said, let there be a contest and between some of the young men. So 12 sons of Benjamin and 12 sons of the servants of David came out to have a battle with each other, a contest with each other. And you can see the bitterness of the opposition, that they each grabbed the head of the other, and each of them plunged their knife into the side of their opponent so that all of them fell down, either wounded or dead. And this then spread to a conflict between all the soldiers that were present. Everybody's blood was up, and there was a severe battle that was fought between Abner and Israel and Joab and the servants of David. And Israel was beaten in the battle. We're told in the midst of this battle that Asahel, the brother of Joab, there are 3 sons of Zeruiah. Zeruiah was the sister of David, and she had Joab, Abishai, and Asahel, those 3 brothers that served David and were mighty men in David's army. And during this battle, Asahel, who was said to be as swift as a gazelle, he was fast. He set his sights in the battle on chasing down Abner the general, and he was going to strike him down as his prize in the battle. And Abner turned around and warned him twice that he should turn aside and go after one of the younger men and take their armor or whatever, but he should turn aside from him, because how could he answer Joab if he killed him? And he would not turn aside. And so after a second warning, we're told that Abner thrust back with his spear. And on the backside of his spear, he had a sharpened point that they would use to stick their spears in the ground. And he ran that spear all the way through Asahel, the old warrior, and killed him. And he died there by the road. And so this is going to lead to further problems in the future. Abner, after they had fought that day and there had been a lot of death, we're told that Abner called out from the top of a hill where he found a defensive place to hold off the servants of David, that is there just going to let the bloodshed go on, that brothers are killing brothers. And Joab listened to what he had to say and blew the trumpet and called off the rest of the battle. And we're told that Abner crossed across the Arabah, that great rift in the earth that the Jordan River and the Dead Sea and the Sea of Galilee lie in, and went across the Jordan River and returned to Mahanaim. There were 19 servants of David killed in that battle, but 360 servants of Benjamin died. So you can see David's men are mighty and strong and battle-hardened, and God was with them. And it's going to show really how this whole conflict is going to come out in the end. They buried Asahel in Bethlehem, the city of Jesse and David, and they say that Joab and his men then returned to Hebron. Well, one of the lessons you learn as we read through these stories again is the patience of David to wait on the Lord to work out these events. He does what he has to do to defend himself and defend his kingdom, but he doesn't take any offensive action to try to invade Israel. He's going to let God work that out. So we should be sober, we should be alert, we should be vigilant, but we should trust in God's providence to handle the things that belong to God and do our private, individual duties that God has commanded us to do. In looking at the chapter 3, it shows the period of two kingdoms in Israel continuing, and the war went on between the two kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel and Judah. But David continually grew stronger, and Saul's house continually grew weaker. And so then we're told about David's family that he had built up while he was living those 7 years in Hebron. We're given the names of his wives and the sons that were born to him. Ahinoam had Amnon, the oldest son of David, and of course he's later going to be assassinated by his brother. Abigail gave birth to Kileab. He is also called Daniel in the book of Chronicles. He maybe died at a young age because we don't hear about him anymore later on. Maacah gave birth to Absalom. Absalom, killed Amnon later and is going to try to take over the kingdom, and he himself ends up being killed in a rebellion against his father later on. Haggith has Adonijah. Adonijah, very handsome, but yet he is going to go against his father's wishes to try to take the kingdom from Solomon. And as a result of some intrigue against Solomon, he is going to be put to death. So look, David has all of these wives, and he has all of these sons. But look at the tragedy, the heartache that comes in David's life. God had said from the beginning he made a male and female, and they should become one flesh. That polygamy was not something that God intended, but it was something that was built up by men and became a tradition in the patriarchal age. And, even going back to Abraham, we see the problems that happened with these multiple wives when they were brought in. But by tradition, people were justifying this practice. God's law said they should not multiply wives, but we're told the rabbis had interpreted that as, well, don't go overboard in multiplying wives. So David may have in good conscience thought he was doing what was right, and what other kings did and what some of the patriarchs did in having multiple wives, and he did the same. But we know from God's word and what is revealed in the New Testament as well, that was never God's intention. And so God, through their bad examples, shows the consequences and the heartache and all of the disorder that comes through polygamy and why God never intended it. But you have to learn by examples during this time where God is just overlooking some of these sins until it's time to give a fuller and more complete revelation. So he's kind of teaching people through their own poor choices that this polygamy is a bad idea. And look at all the death and turmoil it led to. Abner rebels against Ishbosheth. Turned out that Abner, the general, was a very strong man and strong personality, and Ishbosheth was a weak leader, and he made himself, Abner did, strong in Saul's family, and as he grew stronger, he took one of Saul's concubines and married her. And we can read later on that this idea of marrying the dead king's one of his wives was a way to make a claim to the throne. That wasn't always taken that way by everybody, but it was oftentimes taken that way. And so he was questioned and accused by Ishbosheth of doing something wrong and trying to claim the rule for himself by taking Saul's concubine. And this offended Abner, who had put him on the throne. And he began to swear and say that he was going to see that the kingdom was turned over to David. And he acknowledges the fact that it was known that the kingdom had been sworn to David, and he had been anointed to be the king by Samuel. So it shows how rebellious a lot of these people were in the northern kingdom of Israel there, and the house of Saul, that even though they knew about these prophecies, and it was well known about David's destiny in God's eyes, that they were still resisting these things. So after this, Abner tries to get with the elders of the land of Israel and turn the kingdom over to David. So he comes before David. He contacts him. They make a covenant. Abner brings Israel to David under a covenant. He brings 20 men with him. They have a feast and a meal. And David's one request, if this is going to happen, is that his wife Michal be given back to him. You remember his first wife Michal, that was Saul's daughter, that he killed 100 Philistines was the dowry that he was to pay in order to marry her. She was taken after David had to flee from court and given to another man by her father. And she'd been living as another man's wife. And David said, I want my wife back. And so you can see how weak Ishbosheth is, that he agrees to send Michal back to David, and that really he's not much of a ruler or not much in control of what's really going on in his own kingdom. Michal's husband that she was living with at that time followed her weeping, and then he was told by Abner he needed to go back home. And so David got his wife Michal back. And then after that, Abner promotes the kingship of David, and he leaves town. And Abner and David have made this agreement. Well, Joab was away on a raid. The king or the governor, the general over David's army, had been out fighting against their enemies, and he came in and heard about Abner coming and speaking to David and this whole goings on that happened while he was gone. And he went in and he rebuked David and told David that he was making a mistake by having Abner there, and that he was just there to spy out the land and work against his kingdom. And then he secretly went out and sent messengers after Abner and called him back. And he met him in the gate and walked up to him in a friendly way, and then pulled out his sword and killed Abner, because he had killed his brother Asahel in a time of war. But this was committed in a time of peace. It was just outright murder that was committed against Abner. And David, of course, didn't want to have anything to do with the guilt of this murder. He knew nothing about what Joab was going to do. He wasn't behind it in any way whatsoever. And so he cursed the house of Joab, that they'd have illness in that house and all kinds of problems in their family because of this murder that he had carried out. And David did everything he could to show that he was innocent of the murder of this prince of the house of Saul that was so influential in the northern kingdom. Joab and the people were ordered to mourn in sackcloth over the death of Abner. David walked behind the bier as they carried his body to the place of burial, and David wept behind the body in that funeral. And he chanted and lamented, and he refused to eat anything until sundown. And all of this was pleasing to the people when they saw the way that David had mourned over Abner and shown himself to have been innocent in this matter, although there was suspicion that he might have been behind what Joab did. David, through his behavior, showed to the people that he had nothing to do with it. And certainly many times righteous people that do what is right, our names are falsely slandered for one cause or another. And we should do all that we can to try to show our innocence, but sometimes that can't be controlled. It shouldn't be surprised that those kind of things happen from time to time. So the people David expressed his admiration for Abner and his servants privately, and he expresses the fact that he feels too weak to deal with the sons of Zeruiah. These nephews of his that serve in his army, these mighty warriors, they have too much influence and power in his family that he doesn't feel like he can move any further against them. So there's always to be borne in mind in government that leaders aren't always able to do everything that they want to do. David, even though he was king, he didn't have absolute power to deal with everybody under him in his kingdom. There were a lot of influential powers there, but he was going to leave the punishment of Joab to God, that God would deal with him in his good time. And certainly that did happen. So we're told then about the king in Gilead, Ishbosheth, and how he was murdered by a couple of his servants that ended up taking him out of the way so that David can come to the throne of all of Israel. Ishbosheth lost his courage when Abner, his general and main supporter in the family and the kingdom, had been murdered, and it greatly discouraged him. Probably the wise thing would have been himself to go to David and turn the rule over to him, but he didn't do that. He was resting at noon in his house, and Abana and Rechab, two of his servants and sons of Benjamin, they came in under false pretenses into his chamber where he was sleeping and murdered him and cut off his head, and they took his head then to David, and they have this selfish motive for themselves that causes them to do wicked things, and they think that David's going to reward them because they bring him the head of Ishbosheth. And another bad calculation by some selfish, greedy people that lift their hands against somebody and murder an innocent man in his bed. They were told and introduced to Mephibosheth. He is the son of Jonathan. We're told that when the battle went against Saul and Jonathan and they died on the battlefield, that there was panic there in the city, and that the nurse of Mephibosheth, the nurse for Jonathan's son, was rushing out in such a hurry that she dropped the boy when he was 5 years old and injured his legs to where he was lame the rest of his life. It's something out of all of the descendants of Saul, he's the one that's going to be honored by David, that's going to have a peaceful life. And it shows even though you have misfortunes and you have limitations that might come upon you in your youth and maybe even be crippled, that you can go on to live a happy life. And maybe sometimes the person with these few advantages like he had end up having a more enjoyable life than these other powerful people that are involved in all kinds of intrigue and trouble. Well, Ishbosheth was slain and killed while he's resting in his house at noontime, and they go and report this to David, and they claim the murder was in God's providence. They took up their hand. Well, it's not for us to do some wicked deed and say we're helping God out. We have to let God's providence play out in God's way and not try to do wicked things and claim it's all God's will. We hear this a lot. And David executed these two murderers as well, just like he did the Amalekite before that told the story about killing Saul. He said they killed a righteous man that and since from their own mouths they told what they did, they should be destroyed from the earth. He ordered his young men to execute them and cut off their hands and feet to show contempt for these men that would raise their hand against Ishbosheth in the way that they did. So Ishbosheth's head was buried in Abner's tomb there in Hebron. Then we're told that about David being made king over all Israel. He became king of Judah at 30 years old. He becomes king of all of Israel at the age of 37. And the rulers, the elders of the tribes of Israel come to David, and they say, they came to him at Hebron and said, "Behold, we are your bone and your flesh. Previously, when Saul was king over us, you were the one who led Israel out and in. And the Lord said to you, you will shepherd my people Israel, and you will be a ruler over Israel." So now the people have come to respect the prophecy, respect the anointing that was made 20 years before by Samuel. They've been resisting the rule of David up till now. But now they say, you're our relative. We realize you're the one that went out and fought the Lord's battle as our general in your youth and have fought against our enemies. And we recognize all of the good that you have done, and you'll be our shepherd and ruler like God said. And that's the kind of ruler that God expects a ruler to be. One who recognizes he's an under shepherd, that he's looking after God's people, and that he is looking after that which belongs to God, and that he has a responsibility to feed and to protect and care for the people of God. That's the same term that is used for an elder in the Lord's church. Elders are to do the same. They're not there to be lords, but they're there to be servants of the church and to be shepherds for the church and look out for God's people and help them to execute the Lord's commandments that have been revealed. They make a covenant with David and anoint him. He's going to be a shepherd. They're going to be loyal. So David, now at 37 years old, has become the king of Israel, and he reigns as king altogether 40 years. Over all of the kingdom, he reigned 33 years. And the first thing that he does after he becomes king is capture the city of Jerusalem. It had been captured back in the days of Joshua, but evidently they hadn't taken control of the city after they had captured it, and the Jebusites were able to rebuild the city, reoccupy it, and it had been in the hands of the Jebusites since that time. It lays as a strategic place between the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. It's right in the middle. It's a no man's land, sort of like Washington, D.C. Doesn't belong to any state. It's its own District of Columbia. Well, the city of Jerusalem represented that in the nation of Israel. It's right in the middle between the two kingdoms. And the Jebusites didn't think that David could take the city. It was had a very strong wall. It was a well-defended height. And they said to David, "You shall not come in here, but the blind and the lame will turn you away," thinking David cannot enter here. Well, God was with David. And arrogance and overconfidence is never a good thing for any people. And they think that they're going to be able to resist David, just like enemies of the gospel and the enemies of God in our day. They think they're going to overcome the truth. They're going to squash out the church and get rid of the gospel, and it's never going to succeed. It'll never succeed. God is with his people. So Joab becomes the chief over David's army again. He fell out of favor, I'm sure, after he had killed Abner. But David had made a promise that anyone who was able to go through the water tunnel, there was a underwater tunnel that went from the pool outside the city walls up into the city. And Joab was the man that led the people through that waterway that was cut through the rocks and got inside the city secretly and was able to open the gates and conquer the city. And then he's back in his position as general of the army again. So Joab, not a godly man, but a man that was very good at his job as a general and a very powerful warrior. Here you can see the location of the city of Jerusalem. You see Gibeah in Benjamin is north. That was the capital of Saul. And then you see Bethlehem, the city of David, 7 miles south of Jerusalem. And this Jabesh city of Jerusalem was made the capital by David. That was the place where Mount Moriah was located, where Abraham had offered Isaac. It's the place where Melchizedek was the king back in the days of Abraham, king of righteousness, king of peace. And of course, that made it a remarkable place. There was a high priest of God that had been in that city. And David's going to remember that and prophesy about the Christ is going to be a priest after the order of Melchizedek that was king in the city of Jerusalem, the city of peace. And you can see in the smaller illustration there, and also there's a blow-up of what the city was like. That part that's in gray shows the old city of David. And David then rebuilt all of the defenses. He put Joab to work as the general in building up all of the walls and the mounds and making the city strong. When it was heard about David becoming the king of all of Israel and conquering the city and being in need of a residence there in the new royal city, Hiram, the king of Tyre, was an ally of David, and one that was very loyal also to his son Solomon. And he sent to David the cedar to build a palace for himself in the city of Jerusalem. We're told in verse 12 of chapter 5, and David realized that the Lord had established him as king over Israel, and that he had exalted his kingdom for the sake of his people Israel. So see how David recognizes the providence of God, that God is behind these things, that David is just an instrument in God's will, and that his purpose there is to help the people of Israel. See how David is a man after God's own heart in his faith and dedication to the Lord and to his purpose, and why he is such a beloved character in the Word of God. Well, after David had conquered the city and made it his capital, there's a list in chapter 13 through 16 of other wives and sons that were born to David. So David continues to make the error of following human tradition and adding wives and building up his family, but we know it's all going to bring heartache and trouble to him in his latter days, because he has married all of these women. Eventually, he's going to have as his wife Bathsheba, and you can see on the map there from David, the little cross on the figure shows those that are in the line and genealogy of Christ, that there's going to be Nathan born to Bathsheba and also Solomon. And you have in the Gospel of Luke the physical seed of David to Mary, and that's traced through Nathan. And through Solomon, you trace the official, his supposed father, Joseph, was also from this kingly line. And so on both sides of his family, in both ways, Jesus is the son of David and the rightful one to rule over the people of God. And God's going to exalt Jesus Christ. So it's interesting to look at how God is working out this plan, and there's a plan going on. Well, at the end of chapter 5, we read about David's first battles as the king of Israel against the Philistines. I guess while the kingdom was divided, they didn't see Judah and Israel as a big threat while they were divided and fighting each other. But as soon as David has become the king of all of the land, then the Philistines take notice, and they raise a great army. And they come against David and attack towards the city of Jerusalem. And they spread out, as you can see, they come from Gath and spread out in the valley of Rephaim. And in that valley, then David flees out of the city. He doesn't stay in that walled city, but he flees out to the stronghold in the cave of Adullam. And he inquires of God whether he should go up and attack these Philistines. And God tells him by all means he should go up and attack, and he will overcome them. And David and his servants and his army fight against the Philistines, and they break through them just like the breaking through of water during a flood. And so he names the place Baal Perazim, and that means the breaking through of water. And they take their idols away from them that they leave behind and destroy them. But the Philistines aren't finished. They go and raise a bigger army than the one they had before. And there is a second battle that is fought in that valley. And the Lord, again, is inquired of by David. And the Lord tells him what the battle plan should be. When he hears the sound of marching soldiers in the top of the trees, that means the Lord has gone out before him in the battle, and that David should attack. And David, of course, attacks, and he routs the enemy and drives them from the central part of the tribe of Benjamin at Geba all the way over to Gezer. He wins a great victory against these Philistines. And so David's rule starts off with a great victory. We're told in the book of Chronicles that David was growing stronger and stronger because the Lord was with him. Well, I hope that this lesson will have some basic principles that you'll want to read about and study further, that you, like David, will learn to put God first in your life, that you'll examine your life and see those things that are practiced, that you may be following that are only traditions of men and not the true Word of God, and that we'll lay aside anything that we discover is not according to the gospel of Jesus Christ. David needed to study harder and not make the mistake of polygamy that's going to come back to haunt him. Well, I hope this lesson will be a blessing to you. Next time we'll look at David's growing kingdom as he going to take over territory from the Euphrates River to the river of Egypt. David is going to bring the ark to Jerusalem, and he's going to begin to be the great king over many other kings during this early days of his reign. Well, Lord willing, we'll study that next time.